like the looks of Turned Edge Machine Applique, like in this butterfly, yet you're a little hesitant to make it because it looks slow, tedious, and simply hard? You know what? It's not. It's actually very quick and easy, and you can certainly make it. Let me show you how. Hi, I'm Rugile from Magical Dreams. In this video, I will share with you a very simple and quick Turned Edge Machine Applique technique that uses lightweight interfacing. This technique is usually used for simple shapes such as circles, yet you can make quite difficult and complex shapes with it as well. For the demo for this video, I've chosen this butterfly that has many different tricky parts. It has outward curves, inward curves, sharp outer points, and deep inner points. Also, with this butterfly, I can show you how to handle large applique shapes like the silhouette and the tiny shapes such as these inner wings. I've used those butterflies already in 2 projects. The first one is called Butterflies in the Meadow. The second project is work in progress, and you can see it behind me. Turned Edge Machine Applique with interfacing is certainly my favorite applique technique. I really want you to try it, and to encourage you to do so and to make things easier for you, I have a very comprehensive and detailed photo guide on my website. Additionally, I created this infographic that summarizes all the key steps of the technique. You can download it from my website, print it, and have it at your workbench and use whenever you need it. So, let's jump into things and see how to applique with turned edges using interfacing. Let's start by talking about interfacing. There are many different materials that can be used for applique with interfacing. They may be called interfacing, interlining, or stabilizer, depending on the use case. For turned edge applique, we need a lightweight, non-stretch interfacing that is robust and soft at the same time. There are essentially 4 different types of materials that works well as interfacing for turned edge applique. The most basic option is a piece of fabric. You could even use the same fabric as you use for applique itself. Yet the fabric is usually more expensive than other types of interfacing. And it is thick. It may even thicken the quilt sandwich to a degree where it is hard to quilt it. As an alternative for the scrap fabric, you can use a fabric specifically designed to be used as interfacing. It is called woven interfacing, and is very strong and light, 2 to 3 times lighter than a regular quilting cotton. Woven interfacing is also soft and easy to work with. As a bonus, woven interfacing sometimes comes with a coating that allows to temporarily iron fuse it to the fabric. You cannot see it, but you can feel it. In applique, the sticky coating permits ironing the applique shape to the background fabric before stitching, and thus no pinning is needed. Using 100% cotton woven interfacing is perfect for 100% cotton quilts, for allergic people for instance. The second option is non-woven interfacing that is made by pressing together synthetic fibers to form a cloth. Thus, it is strong only in one direction and can tear rather easily to the other. One needs to be more delicate when working with non-woven interfacings. Non-woven interfacings are either fusible or sew-in, as the one I have here. Sew-in interfacings may feel a little different depending on the brand. This one is a little more sturdy, whereas the other one is fluffy and fleece-like. All sew-in interfacings are identical on both sides. Fusible non-woven interfacings may also feel different depending on the brand. These 2 examples are made of the same polyester and have almost identical weight, yet they look and feel differently. One is more sturdy and the other one is more soft. All fusible interfacings have a glue coating on one side that can be seen as small droplets. This means that applique prepared with fusible non-woven interfacing can be iron fused to the background fabric, and no or little finning is needed. All lightweight non-woven interfacings are cheap, readily available, robust, thin, and more or less soft. Thus, they are a nice option for turned edge applique. The last option is soluble embroidery stabilizer that washes away in cold water. It is thin, soft, and non-stretch in both directions. Thus, it is very easy to work with. On top of that, soluble embroidery stabilizer disappears after the first wash, leaving no evidence of interfacing ever used. That is my favorite option for this applique technique. Probably there are more materials you could use for this applique method. As long as it is soft, non-stretch and lightweight, it will do just fine. Okay, so let's look at the other tools and materials we will need to applique with interfacing. First of all, we will need an outline. I will use butterflies in the meadow applique pattern for this tutorial. You can find the link to the pattern in the video description below. We will also need some general sewing equipment, like sewing machine, disappearing fabric pen, a needle, pins or an iron depending on a type of interfacing, and fabric scissors. Pinking shears are nice to have, but not essential. To handle small applique shapes is seam ripper, a cocktail straw, and a narrow blunt tool that does not poke holes in the interfacing and fits inside the cocktail straw is very handy. I will use a cuticle pusher from my manicure toolbox that is flat and round. From the materials we will need fabric. I will use light green for the background, dark red for the butterfly silhouette, and some lighter fabric scraps for the small second layer wing decorations. Also, we will need matching thread and a piece of interfacing. I will use a soluble embroidery stabilizer that is my favorite type of interfacing. Yet, I will need a piece of non-soluble interfacing to protect the light top layer wing shapes from the dark red color on the butterfly silhouette. And finally, to finish this butterfly, with little embroider antennas, we will need a piece of embroidery stabilizer. We could use a soluble embroidery stabilizer the same as for the applique itself. Yet, for embroidering on your domestic sewing machine, I would suggest to use a fusible stitch and tear embroidery stabilizer that provides more stability to the project. And that is it. We are ready to make those butterflies. The first step in making Turned Edge Machine Applique with interfacing is to trace an outline. Trace it directly onto the interfacing using the disappearing fabric pen. When using a fusible interfacing, trace onto the smooth side that has no adhesive droplets. Leave sufficient space for the 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch, that is around 5 to 7 mm wide seam allowance. Trace the shapes for all the layers at once. When tracing multiple shapes on a single piece of interfacing, make sure to leave sufficient space for both seam allowances between individual outlines. For symmetrical shapes, mark their orientation at once to avoid confusion later. I will put an L for the left and an R for the right. Once all the applique shapes are traced onto the interfacing, we are ready for the second step. That is to stitch the fabric and the interfacing together. For that, place the interfacing onto the right side of the fabric, leaving sufficient space for the seam allowance. If you are using fusible interfacing and planning to iron fuse the applique shapes to the vase fabric before stitching, make sure that the sticky side with the glue droplets is facing the fabric. For the small upper wing shapes, the fabric is very light compared to the dark red butterfly silhouette fabric. So place an additional layer of non-soluble interfacing beneath the light fabric. That will prevent the red color from bleeding through, and the light fabric will remain white and not stained. Do the same for all the top layer wing shapes to maintain the same thickness for the applique. Okay, now we're ready to go to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, stitch on the traced outline using a straight line stitch. Be sure to use a matching thread, as it will be visible on the edge of the final applique. The stitch line will define the outer edge of your final applique shape, thus it is important that the stitch line closely matches the traced outline. Stitch slowly and turn steadily to meet the curves. The only exception is the deep inner points. When you come to a deep inner point, make sure to go not too deep inside regardless of the drawn outline. there is a certain limit to how deep the deep inner points can be. You need no less than 6 to 8 threads between the two stitch lines to maintain at least a minimal seam allowance on both sides. At the very tip of the point, make a wide angle between the last two stitches, even if the outline dictates otherwise. In this way, stitch around all the outlines of all the shapes. Change the thread between shapes if needed to have a matching thread for all the applique pieces. Once the stitching is complete, it is time for the third step, preparing the seam allowance. For that, first cut out the shapes, leaving 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, which would be around 5 to 7 millimeters wide. I'm using pinking shears that help to reduce fabric bulk. It is not essential to use pinking shears, but it is nice to have, especially for the second layer wing shapes with an additional layer of interfacing. If you are using regular fabric scissors, it is recommended to make small perpendicular cuts into the seam allowance all over the perimeter of the shape to reduce the fabric bulk formed by the seam allowance. Once all the shapes are cut out with the seam allowance, let's prep the seam allowance fabric to make it lay flat and nice once turned under. Let's start from the deep inner points. There are 4 of those on the butterfly silhouette and none on the smaller wing shapes. At the deep inner points, make a single cut in the seam allowance straight to the point. Make sure to cut right in the middle between the two seams to leave maximally large seam allowance on both sides. Cut all the way to the seam thread, but be very careful not to cut into it. Next, let's identify inward curves. There are 4 of those on the butterfly silhouette and 2 on each of the small upper wing shapes. At the inward curves, make multiple cuts into the seam allowance perpendicular to the seam. This allows the seam allowance to stretch without bulging the entire applique shape once it is turned inside out. Do that for each and every inward curve. Finally, let's trim the excess fabric from the sharp outer points. There are 4 of those on the butterfly silhouette and 2 on each of the small applique shapes. At the sharp outer points, imagine that the seam allowance has to fit inside this narrow gap between the 2 neighboring seams. So cut the seam allowance mimicking the angle and the shape of the seam. At the very tip of the point, cut a few millimeters away from the point, leaving a minimal seam allowance. Do the same for each outer point. Now, once all the cutting into the seam allowance is complete, let's check if we made any cuts into the seam thread or if the seam is intact. There are so many cuts to make that it is almost certain that the seam thread will be cut somewhere. Yep, Here it is. The seam thread is cut on the small upper wing shape. Luckily, it is very quick and easy to fix this problem. Just go back to your sewing machine and make a few stitches around the cut to seal it. Okay, looks perfect. Now, all the seam allowances are ready. It is time for the fourth step, turning the shape inside out. To do that, you need an opening in the interfacing. So for the larger butterfly silhouette shape, simply make a small cut into the interfacing with your scissors. Be careful not to cut into the front fabric. Then, widen the opening to be large enough to turn the shape inside out. Do not cut closer than 1/4 of an inch to the seam and leave much more if possible. Otherwise, the interfacing will not be able to hold the shape. For the small shapes, use a seam ripper to make a small opening. With a seam ripper, there is no danger of damaging the fabric, and it is much easier to handle small shapes than with scissors. Also, make sure you cut into the right interfacing, not into the one that is protecting the fabric from the color bleed through. Now we are ready to turn the shape inside out. For large shapes, simply use your fingers. Put your thumbs inside, help with your other fingers from outside, and turn. At this stage, do not worry that the shape is not super beautiful, and do not care about all the little curves and corners being nicely pushed out. We will take care of that later. Now simply get the bulk of the shape out. For the small shapes, it is rather hard to handle them with fingers alone. So to make things easier, let's use a straw and a narrow tool, which is a round flat cuticle pusher in my case. First, put the straw inside the shape through the opening and point it to the one of the sharp outer points. Then, press onto the fabric, not onto the interfacing, and push the outer point inside the straw. Once you pull out the straw, the corner is turned out already. Do the same for the other outer points. Put the straw in, press the fabric in, and take the straw out. Do the last corner in the same way. As a result, the shape is nicely turned inside out. Repeat the same for all the little shapes. Okay. The shapes do not look very pretty yet, so it is time for the fifth step, fully pushing out the seam. To do that, I like to use the round edge of my scissor blade. The other blade is too sharp and will poke holes into the fabric or interfacing, so I'll use the round one. Put the scissor blade inside the applique shape and press onto the fabric at the seam. It is important to press onto the fabric, as the interfacing is easy to tear. Go with the scissor blade through the seam and gently press it out. See how the seam straightens. I was just pressing, going through the seam with this motion, and pushed it out. Pushing to the other direction is harder, as the interfacing is on the way. So I will turn the shape and work from the other side. Put the blade in and go again. Press onto the fabric, work all the way up, and straighten the seam. One wing is complete. You can see how much nicer it gets after pushing out the seam. Do the same for all the other wings. You know that the seam is completely pushed out when you see the thread between the fabric and the interfacing at the edge of the applique. For the outer points, push them as much as you can, and we will take care of them later. For the small shapes, let's use a finer tool. I have this flat round cuticle pusher that I really like for the job. So let's do the same again. Put the tool in and press onto the seam. Go both directions to fully push out all the parts. See how much nicer, larger, and more accurate the shape gets. Do the same for all the other small shapes. The last thing is to pull out the sharp outer points. You see, they are not very sharp yet. So let's take a needle and pull the fabric out from the outside. Let's start from the one that is hardly pushed out at all. The fabric and the interfacing are both folded inside. So put the needle in, grab onto the fabric, and gently pull it out. Using a needle, it is possible to make the sharp points really pointy, but you need to be careful. Pull gently because it is easy to pull out some threads. The seam allowance is very narrow at this point. Here I pulled too much and got a little thread out. Since it is only a single thread, I will simply trim it. Let's do the same for the other outer points. Grab onto the fabric and pull out gently. Repeat until you do not see the fabric and the interfacing folded inwards. I forgot to do one point, and you can easily spot it. It is way less pointy. So let's complete this point as well and do the same for the other outer points of the small shapes. Now all the shapes are ready with all the edges and points nicely unfolded and straightened. We can proceed to the sixth step, assembling and stitching down the applique. First, let's put down the small upper wing shapes to the butterfly silhouette. Knowing which shape is left and which one is right comes handy here, as they are very similar, but do not look good when inverted. Align the four middle points of all the small shapes in the middle of the butterfly silhouette. Also, match the small wing shape direction with the wings of the butterfly silhouette. I usually pin all my applique shapes regardless of the interfacing I am using. This time, I have a soluble embroidery stabilizer that cannot even be fused to the base. When using a fusible interfacing, the applique shapes can be iron fused to the background. Yet, you need to be aware of several things. First, the heat transfer with multiple layers of fabric is not that efficient, and the shapes do not always attach well enough to the background. This may cause problems when stitching. So, I usually put a pin anyway, just in case. Second, I frequently make multi-layer appliques. This means that to prevent the applique shape from sticking to the ironing surface, I would have to assemble the applique from the other end. In this case, I would start by attaching the butterfly silhouette to the base fabric and only then attach the small wing shapes. When designing a quilt, however, I like to assemble the entire applique piece beforehand and only then decide where to put it on the quilt top. This way I can see better how the final quilt top will look like. And the last thing is that some interfacings can get stiffer once the glue is melted. This stiffens the applique, and you may not like that for the quilts that will be worn. Yet, I have not tried all the interfacings out there, and some of them may work just perfect. Also, fusing the applique to the background may be very desirable when stitching a very large applique piece. There, even little shifts between applique and the base may cause large wrinkles and the quilt top will not be flat anymore. The bottom line is, try different fusible interfacings beforehand and decide if you are going to iron fuse them or not. Otherwise, pins will never fail you. And well, there is one more nice thing about pinning. You can always correct it if something is not perfect. And for perfectionists like me, that is very important. Okay, butterfly is assembled and we can move on to the sewing machine and stitch it down. At the sewing machine, stitch the applique using a simple straight line stitch. That is the fastest way to attach the applique. If you want to imitate the needle turn hand applique, use a narrow blind hem stitch. Also, any decorative stitch is possible depending on your liking. When using a straight line stitch, top stitch the applique very closely to the edge, approximately 1 mm away. Stitch to the very end of the outer points, making sure the applique cannot be peeled off of the base. This way, stitch down all the wing shapes. Once the stitching is done, hide and secure the threads using your favorite method. Now the butterfly applique is completely assembled into a single piece. It's time to attach it to the background fabric. Here, repeat the same as we just did for the wing shapes. Pin the applique in place and stitch it down around the perimeter of the butterfly silhouette with a straight line stitch. Use a matching thread. And here it is, the butterfly applique is complete. It has all the layers nicely sewn together. It is rather thick due to the many layers of fabric and interfacing. Thus, when quilting, I would not suggest to quilt all over the applique. You may run into troubles. Rather, quilt around the edge of the butterfly. It will make the butterfly pop even more. The applique is finished, yet the butterfly lacks a small detail, antennas. So even though it is not a part of the applique, I will show you how to quickly embroider such a small detail as antennas on your domestic sewing machine. In addition to the tools we already use for the applique, to embroider antennas we will need a piece of fusible embroidery stabilizer. In theory, we could use the same soluble embroidery stabilizer as we use for applique, but for embroidering on your domestic sewing machine, this one gives much nicer stability for the project and no embroidery frame is needed. Also, we will use an iron to fuse the stabilizer to the fabric. So let's turn the applique around and put a piece of fusible embroidery stabilizer on the back of the applique. Then, fuse it to the fabric with a hot iron. Add a second layer of embroidery stabilizer for more stability. Now, take a pen and draw nice antennas. I'm using a disappearing fabric pen, so in theory I could draw the antennas on the front of the applique. Still, I do not fully trust it somehow and tend to work from the back of the fabric. I think those antennas look pretty good, so let's go to the sewing machine and embroider them. When sewing from the back, it is very important to pull out the bobbin thread to avoid knots in the front of the project. And again, you could always embroider from the front if you mark the design with the disappearing fabric pen, or use a soluble embroidery stabilizer to transfer the design and put it in front of the project. Probably the embroidery would look better when doing it from the front. Yet, if you embroider from the back as I do here, pull out the threads. To make the antenna slightly more prominent, I am using a triple straight line stitch, also known as a triple stretch stitch. There, the needle goes forward, backward and forward again, making a single stitch 3 times thicker. Okay, the embroidery is complete. The last step is to peel off the embroidery stabilizer. Do it one layer at a time. Carefully remove the paper at the stitch line, not to pull out some threads. Use a seam ripper to help you with the paper. Finally, secure those threads. In theory, they are secured, but just in case, I like to make an additional knot. Let's trim some of those threads. And here it is. Butterfly is finished. Thank you for watching. I hope it was useful and you will certainly try this applique technique. If you do, please let me know how it went. Happy appliquing and see you in the next video. Bye!